In 4.2, as we're finding areas of triangles, the thing that we were working on in class to understand that all triangles are exactly half of a parallelogram helps us to remember that the formula for the area of a triangle is 1/2 times the base times the height. Just like in parallelograms, the base can actually be any of the sides of a triangle, but then the height is going to be the important one to find. It has to be perpendicular to the base, or it has to make a 90-degree angle to that base. For example 1, we're going to be finding the area of a triangle, and we're going to do the formula fill-in final just like we did for parallelograms. So we're going to start with the formula, which is area equals 1/2 times base times height. And then when we go to fill that in, area is going to be equal to 1/2. And when we start looking at our triangle, again, the height has to be the one that makes the 90-degree angle, and the base could be any of these sides. Since neither of the lines makes a 90-degree angle over here, then we can say for sure that it's not possible for this to be the base or the height. So now we're just choosing between these two, which it could technically be either, since the 90-degree angle goes either way or both ways. So for those of you that like to, put the base on the bottom, that's fine this time. You can call this the base and the height this one this time. So when you fill in the base to be 5 inches and then multiply that by the height of 8 inches, then you've got a couple of choices here, some things that you can do and then one thing that you can't do. One thing that you can do because of the properties of multiplication is that you can multiply your whole numbers together to make it easier. So you can do 5 times 8 first, which I think is a pretty good idea. So you can just do 5 times 8, which is 40, and then that will make your life a little bit easier because then you can just cut 40 in half, which if you have to do side math, go for it. Otherwise, you can just know that half of 40 is equal to 20. Another thing that you could do, and we'll get more practice in on this, is you could take half of either one of these numbers, the base or the height. If you're going to do it that way, again, I'd go the smart one. I'd pick the half of the whole number 8 because that's easier to cut in half than 5 is, because once you cut 5 in half, you start getting into like fractions and decimals. But if you were to do it this way, half of 8 would be 4. And then 4 times 5 would be 20, so you see it gets you the same answer. The only thing you can't do is you can't take half of both of these numbers. So we're going to keep talking about that in some of the next examples. But again, there are a couple of choices for things you can do. You can multiply these two together and then divide that product by half, or you can pick one of these to divide in half and then multiply that half by the other number. And when you're all finished, just remember to check your labels. In this case, it was inches, so we would have 20 inches squared as our final answer here. For this first on your own answer, I want to walk you through both ways so that you can kind of get a hang of what I was saying before. You can do it a couple of ways, but then there will be one way you won't be able to do it. So if area equals 1/2 base times height for the triangle, in this case, we could pick the base to be 11, since that was kind of across the bottom, and then it made the 90-degree angle to the 4, so that can be our height. So area is equal to 1/2 times 11 times 4. And one way we said you could do that would be to multiply your base times height first, which would give us 44, and then to take half of that product, and half of 44 would be 22 feet squared. So there's one way to get your answer. Or another way to get that same answer is to start off the same way, area equals 1/2 base times height, and then fill it in the same way, area equals 1/2 times 11 times 4. But I said you could also take half of either the base or the height. Again, like we had before, I wouldn't take half of 11 just because you have to deal with fractions or decimals then, but it's pretty easy to take half of 4. So you would keep going and you could just take half of 4, and so the 11 would stay the same. But then instead of multiplying it by 4 this time, I would multiply it by half of 4, which is 2. And then once I do that, area would be equal to 11 times 2, which is 22. Again, feet squared. So you can kind of see how you get the same answer either way. And again, I could have gotten it if I would have taken just half of 11 and then multiplied half of 11 times 4. I would have been okay. The only thing I cannot do, that you're going to hear me say a lot over the next couple of days, is I cannot take half of both 11 and half of 4 and still end up with the same answer. There's one way to get the answer to the second on your own, which is 110 meters squared. And just to show you the other way again, you can do the same thing, start off the same way, area equals half base times height, area equals 1/2 times 22 times 10. And again, in this case, they're both easy to cut in half since they're both even numbers. But while you might be tempted to cut 10 in half because it gets you a nice small number, 22 times 5 isn't necessarily easier to do in your head. But if I cut 22 in half, then it becomes 11, and then I can multiply 11 times 10, which many of you know your, oops, I just realized I accidentally made a mistake there. Many of you know your 10s and your 11s pretty easily, so don't copy that because I just made a mistake, but I can't erase it for some reason. Once you cut this one in half, then don't continue to bring the half down. Half of 22 was 11, so now you're just to area equals 11 times 10, and that would also be that same answer of 110 meters squared. So again, you're allowed to cut either one of these in half when you do it, or excuse me, either one of these, your base and your height, in half if you want to do it, but then don't keep bringing the half down, or you can just do your base times your height and then cut that product in half. Example 2 is pretty much the same as example 1, but just giving you a little bit of practice when the height is outside the triangle. So this one's not a right triangle because you can see there are no right angles formed here. So when that happens, you sometimes still just have to keep your lines going on either the bottom of the triangle or down from the corner, and you have to sometimes create your own height by making that 90-degree angle. So sometimes you'll see the height on the outside of the triangle. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to do this on your own if they didn't tell you what that measurement was. But from here, all you have to do is keep your formula the same. Area is still equal to 1/2 times base times height. And then you start filling in from there. In this case, your base is most likely going to be the one along the bottom. Not always, but it works out well this time because either one of these could technically be the one making the 90-degree angle. So we'll just call that bottom number 12 the base, and then we'll just call that other one that makes the 90-degree angle to it the height. And just like we said earlier, you can do a couple of things. 12 and 9 are kind of big, so if I don't want to do those in my head or on side math, I can take half of just one of these, and in my opinion it's easiest to take half of 12 because that's just 6. And then remember, I can't take half of the other one then. If I'm going to take half of one of the numbers, I can only do that once. So the 9 is going to stay the same. And then 6 times 9 is 54. So my area here would be 54 meters squared. And again, if you wanted to do it the other way, you could. You could do 12 times 9, which would be 108. And then you could just take half of 108, which would have gotten you your 54. So either is fine. And for this last on your own problem, here is the work that you could do to get there. Area equals 1/2 times base times height, which would be area equals 1/2 times 15 times 8. I chose to take half of 8 this time because it was easier to do mental math, so it turned into 15 times 4, since I'd already taken half of that. And then 15 times 4 is 60 centimeters squared. Again, if you wanted to do the full side math for 15 times 8, and then divide that product by half or in half, you would still get 60 centimeters squared.